Hey, what's up? This is Dr. Taylor Crick at the Washington Wellness Center, and this is our whiteboard series. These are visuals that I commonly draw for patients in their consultation. So I'm very visual. I do a lot of drawings. And the point is to explain the mechanisms of some of the things that we see all the time. And so, sometimes when I'm talking, it maybe means something, but when we draw it out, a lot of people really grasp these concepts. And one of our focuses here is that when you understand the mechanisms, the solutions become obvious. So today I want to talk about digestion and something that I draw very, very often. And what we're going to draw is this concept of something called, let's draw it over here. SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, there is a ton of controversy about SIBO diagnosis and testing that's out there, and to me, it's almost like, the arguments of like left side versus right side. It's like, who cares? There's all these people with bloating, and what name you put on it does not matter to me. That's all the argument is like, how do we best put a name on it? Not how do we get patients the best results, how do we best put a name on it? But the results that people see in the conventional medical system are absolutely horrible. They'll use, a lot of times, antibiotics because this SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. But I got news for you. You take an antibiotic, it kills off the bacteria. What about the fungal overgrowth that's often accompanying it? So, conventional medicine misses the boat on a lot of these things. So what we do is explain the mechanisms and explain some of the things that have to be under control. So in general, the first thing to know is that the bacteria, like your probiotics that many people know now are very, very good for them, probiotics, fermented foods, etc., and your large number of microbes, they're down here in the large intestine and in the colon. So that's why I draw it like this. And down here, they're good. And there's orders of magnitude, many orders of magnitude higher. Like down here, it's like 10 to the 12th bacteria. Up here, it's like 10 to the 2nd bacteria. So many orders of magnitude more bacteria down here. But what happens is when these bacteria translocate, they migrate up the digestive tract and they colonize in the small intestine where they're not necessarily supposed to be in high quantities. Then these bacteria, what they do in the small intestine is they ferment certain sugars and starches and fibers. So think of fermentation of like opening a beer or something that there's gas produced. Well, if you produce a bunch of gas in your colon, you fart it out, right? If you produce a bunch of gas in your small intestine, this really, really, really long hose, well, guess what? It feels like somebody is, let's draw it over here, blowing up a balloon inside your stomach. And I'll draw that for people, and they're like, yes, that is me. I wish that somebody would just, let some of the air out because it builds right here and it's this bloat. And people will say, I love my morning belly, I hate my afternoon belly. People say, I feel like I'm pregnant again. This is a really, really big problem, and it's really bad. So a couple things that have to happen. So yes, there's a bacterial overgrowth. Yes, antibiotic usage makes sense if there's a bacterial overgrowth, but it wipes out the rest of the microbiome. It does nothing for the fungus. So there's some things that have to happen. One thing that's commonly seen with this is, let's put it up here, low stomach acid, which is the opposite of what most people think, and if you think that, the conventional wisdom on stomach acid is you have to take antacids, and that's 180 degrees the exact opposite. If you don't have enough acid in your stomach, first off, this valve at the bottom of your stomach won't open properly, and then things just don't begin to function properly. Digestion works north to south. So if you're starting off, very first in the stomach without enough acid production, it disrupts everything below that. So stomach acid is necessary to neutralize these bacteria. So you need good stomach acid production. We'll see stomach acid problems all the time. We'll see symptoms like heartburn, reflux. People have a distaste for red meat, or they don't feel like they break it down properly. Maybe they're anemic. They have a hard time absorbing iron. They have a hard time maybe even absorbing B12. And we got a whole video on stomach issues and, intrinsic factor and parietal cells and, etc. with stomach acid. But this is very, very common. So this is maybe problem number one. Problem number two, or maybe it was one, whatever, but is we need to have good motility. So if somebody is not having a bowel movement every single day, things get backed up. If things get backed up, then things can, once again, I'll redraw it, but things can colonize because they're not getting swept out through the gut. So you need to have good motility, which is like the wave of muscle contractions of peristalsis. It's called the migrating motor complex, and it happens the most when you're fasted. So if you're somebody who wakes up and eats and then eats, every 3 hours for the rest of the day, no, every hour, you're never going through this migrating motor complex. It varies in time that it takes for people, and some people it's up to 2 hours on one end to 4 hours on the other end for this migrating motor complex to go through and do what's called a clean sweep. But you've got to have good motility. So the other thing for that we talk about a lot, this is, you can tell this is getting complicated pretty quickly, but you've got to have good gut-brain connection, and it goes both ways. You've got to have good vagus nerve tone. You've got to have good parasympathetic tone. We'll teach people vagus nerve exercises because you've got to train and strengthen that gut-brain connection to have good motility. Then also fasting can help with the migrating motor complex, but you've got to have that neurological integrity of getting these bacteria out of there and keeping those going through. Some other things that you have to have, I was going to draw it. Let's draw it over here. Liver, and let's draw this little green ball. Whatever. Liver and gallbladder. And so what those do, it's not this long, of course, but what those do is they're going to pump bile into the small intestine. That common bile duct is also going to join up with the pancreatic duct and dump enzymes and bile in. So you've got to have good pancreatic enzyme sufficiency. You've got to have good bile production. Bile can get backed up through things like biotoxins like mold and parasites, bad diet. Caucasian women in their 30s and 40s are by far the highest risk for gallbladder issues. There are no signs and symptoms of gallbladder, but if you've got bloating or you've got SIBO, you probably have gallbladder issues. So anyway, all this goes to say that all of this has to be addressed. This looks like a mess now, but all of this has to be addressed. We've got to avoid any foods that can be fermented and produce that gas, because that gas actually causes damage to the gut, and which leads to more problems down the road. So you've got to avoid the triggers. You've got to make sure that stomach acid is on point. You've got to make sure that motility is on point. The bowels have to be moving. Then you can go in with things like herbal antibiotics and antifungals and powerful probiotics. Then you can restore the good and bad bacteria and rebalance the populations of those bacteria. Only then is it going to work. It's really, really common in the conventional world that this stuff just comes roaring back. It's like almost expected that it's gonna come roaring back, because if you just take an antibiotic, you're not fixing any of the underlying problems. You're only killing off the overgrowth, which, yes, is in the name, but it's not the whole problem. So we look at all these things. Digestion has to happen north to south. We've got to have good acid production. We've got to have good enzyme production. We've got to have good motility. We've got to have good balance of bacteria. Then, even then, can we go in and begin to repair some of the damage that's been done to the gut lining. But we've got to start with some of those things. So I draw this all the time, because because bloating is very, very common. Bloating and anxiety and fatigue are the top 3 things that we see in our office. But once again, it's a very complicated puzzle. But if we get all those things functioning in the right order at the right time, it's kind of like an assembly line. If you do it in the right order, magic can happen and out spits like a whole car. And that's the same thing with digestion, is once we get things working in the right order, north to south, all these different components, then out spits happy, healthy poop, and then you have decreased inflammation and good overall health for the long term.